Welcome to cyberspace tonight, everyone. I'm Joni Cooper. I'm the Director of Programming for DocLands Documentary Film Festival here at CFI. And I'm happy to have a chance to talk with Alison Ellwood, the Director of Laurel Canyon, A Place in Time, and Editor Anoosh Terzakian. Thank you, Anoosh, for allowing me to mispronounce it.
Love it. Love it.
I just have to say that this film for me, it was such a nostalgic trip, filled with memories that I had forgotten that I even had until I watched it. And for a time, your film really shows that Laurel Canyon was definitely a neighborly Garden of Eden. And it really seemed to be a time that helped create the place. I got pretty teary-eyed at times.
Yeah, understandably.
Now, what was it that prompted you to even begin this film? Was there a specific catalyst?
I had actually wanted to make this film over 20 years ago when I was living in Los Angeles, but the music rights were owned by so many different people that it was impossible to coordinate it. So when it came back to me through Jigsaw, I was thrilled and was super thrilled that Anoosh was game to go on this journey with me and us as a team, because it was quite the journey.
I can only imagine. I mean, where did you even start to begin to look for all the archive footage that you ended up with?
Well, we had amazing producers and archive folks that, did a broad reach out really early on. From the beginning, we decided we did not want to do any on-camera interviews with the artists. We would only do audio only, partly because some of them are sadly no longer with us, but also because there were so many characters. We wanted it to be immersive and experiential, and every time you'd be popping out to see someone, we thought it would be distracting. So we decided early on to only do audio. So we used old audio recordings and new audio recordings. Anoosh, I think we got virtually everybody who's still living, with the exception of Joni and Neil, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, so everybody was game, which was terrific. And then, of course, Henry Diltz, who Anoosh and I had worked with on the Eagles project years ago, he early on was on board with this project. And once we told people that Henry was involved, because the artists knew him and respected him, they were like, great, we're in. So we really, we didn't have to twist any arms to get people to come on board.
And those were a couple of questions that came to my mind that you just answered in terms of Henry and how it all got started, and about making the decision not to put any on-camera interviews. I found that quite interesting, and it's true. You really did get fully immersed in that, and so that was wonderful. Anoosh, did you find that the clips kind of dictated the story, or did you two edit together once you had all the footage?
Well, I think with most documentaries, but especially with this one, I think the material really is the thing that is speaking to you and is like guiding you. I mean, Alison's vision of Laurel Canyon being the central focus of this entire thing, that was from beginning to end. And just having the connections between these artists and not having them step on each other, I think that was a constant. So, the material itself, you have to mine it to find the stories, but the general arc of knowing how this moment was from light to dark to light again, I think that there was a certain amount of that was already in Alison's mind from the very beginning, and we just approached the material with that filter in mind. And
I just want to jump in 1 second, because the one thing that I was very conscious of and spoke to Anoosh about a lot in the beginning was I didn't want this to feel like an anthology where we go from one artist to the next, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened. And what Anoosh was so brilliant at finding were the absolutely organic connections that these artists have to one another. I mean, who knew that the Monkees were so integral to that whole scene?
And Frank Zappa, too.
Exactly. And, Alice Cooper. I mean, who knew? And the Doors, and what happened with the Doors in Love. I mean, there's so many little stories that obviously some people know, but a lot of people don't know. about all these connections that these artists had. And Anoosh was amazing at just finding those things organically. So it didn't feel like, and this happened now.
I know, and it really did introduce Laurel Canyon as like a container for all of these amazing events. Like my favorite scene is when Graham Nash discovers what he can do with David Crosby and Stephen Stills.
Yeah.
That it still gives me shivers because those harmonies have always been just so strong.
Yeah, it was amazing, and to feel like you're experiencing that moment of discovery with them is what I think is so magical, and that's the magic of Anoosh.
Yeah, exactly, and how they met, and how so many of them met and interconnected, and
I mean, and it's just a fraction of those connections. I mean, it's really incredible because it's with all of those the interlapping that happens, or the overlapping that happened. It feels like, that it's just like the canyon itself. I mean, I think that was something that, Alice and I, our conversations early on too, that the story and the stories of these people and how they're connecting really, you could lay them on the actual map of the canyon, which was another one of those visions, seeing it from above. And that's, I think, Alison's view,
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. And I really did too love how you made the music echo throughout the canyon between scenes. I just loved that. It works so well. It really added to just the feeling of the history and the past and how it reverberates through all of us still. I really loved it.
Yeah, and something really, of all the horrible things associated with COVID, one of the magical things that happened in the canyon is that people would go up and play music out their windows, so that music was still echoing out throughout the canyon, which was really cool when we found out that was happening.
Oh, fantastic. Wow. So do you feel like Laurel Canyon still exists as that character that's in your film? In a way?
The ghost of it does.
Yeah.
A friendly ghost.
Because I imagine a lot of those little cabins are no longer.
No, there's a lot of them that are still there, but they no longer cost $100 to rent a month.
Right.
You'd be lucky. So it's changed, but places change. And that's, if they didn't, then that moment wouldn't have been unique. So.
Yeah. And did you also have a tie to Nurit as well as Henry?
Nurit, yeah. I didn't know her before, but when we met her and when we found out how intricately she was involved and what an amazing photographer she was, then we decided to have that Henry and Nurit would be our only two on-camera characters that would be kind of our guides through this world, because they intimately knew the world, they lived in the world, and they were, like I said, our guides.
Yeah, they were great guides.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just seeing all those beautiful young musicians' faces and voices was just terribly nostalgic.
Yeah.
So was there a specific place that you ended up finding a lot of the footage, or was it just spread out all over the place?
It was pretty spread out. I feel like that was a very, obviously our co-producer and our AP, and I feel like they did like a very wide, they cast a very wide net. Absolutely. But I mean, the photographs from Nurit and Henry, which was another sort of visual backbone that allowed us to tell a lot of story with this audio only, process. I think that was like one of the key minds that we had. And so out of all of those various sources, I think we always would come back to that as sort of an anchor, a visual anchor, to be able to sort of be able to traverse these various characters.
Yeah, like as you said, it would have been a tremendous task just to take it from every bit that you collected.
Yeah.
Do you know how long that initial process of gathering footage took? Like that must have been started long before you actually sat down
We were both laughing.
It was going on the whole time. I mean, basically, Soup to Nuts was about a year, right? Nushi, when we actually got going.
Yeah. So it was.
It was a frantic surge at the beginning. And then they were going the whole time, finding things and running into the room going, look what we just found.
Exactly. And each of these bands and artists, you could create an entire film about them. And if the material is what is giving you the option to find these transitions, then you kind of have to do a wide net on each one of them. And so, there's definitely a few months before we started, but I think a lot of that archival research was interactive with Alison and me in that edit, trying to focus the lens as we were developing those transitional structures.
Yeah. Well, even just looking at the last couple of years, we've had a David Crosby biopic come out and Linda Ronstadt. Mm-hmm. And as we see from those, I mean, I'm so looking forward to documentaries on each and every one of them. Well, look at Joni Mitchell. My goodness, I hope somebody does that.
That would be amazing.
Oh.
That would have to be a series.
I love that. Yeah.
There's so much there. Had you always thought that there would be a part 2, or did that sort of decision to do that come along as you were discovering how much you had?
We actually originally wanted it to be 3 parts, but I think it actually works better as 2 in the end of the day. I think it's a better break because it's sort of, as Anoosh so nicely said, it went from light to dark, back to light, and that darkness is sort of the middle ground.
Yeah, and thank goodness for that, because that part 2 did start off so dark, but it also showed us like we're not really that far along. We're back, into the same place where they were already protesting the police brutality, and here we are back again. It's really sad.
Still dealing with racial injustice, still dealing with wars, still dealing with everything that they were writing and singing about.
Yeah, and that's, as I said, I'm glad that was the middle section so we could start off lighter and end lighter as well. But seeing how it seemed like how the musicians really came into speaking to the times and bearing witness through their songs to the times that they were going through, because they also sort of went through so many changes in terms of what they were doing with their music.
Sure. Yeah. We sort of witnessed them growing up too, and in very tumultuous times. But, people like Neil Young were always activists. Even he was an environmentalist before anybody knew what the word environmentalist meant. Yeah. So, they had those instincts naturally. And the idea of the communal instinct just speaks to that human experience, just so generally anyway, that they were tapped into that, and then the music tapped into it as well. So
yeah, that is true, and thank goodness for those activists in their times, because that's what, when I think about those times and comparing them to now, those are the same songs that come back into my head, along with the newer ones that are coming out now. But oh my gosh, it was a huge, as you said, tumultuous time for all of us.
Absolutely.
Was there any sort of surprising things that you learned doing the research or putting the film together?
I never knew that Stephen Stills was almost a monkey.
Oh.
And the only reason he wasn't was because of his tooth.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that was definitely a shock.
Yeah. There were lots of little surprises.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was a constant, I mean, the transitions themselves and finding those connections, like, those were always a fun surprise, especially when you weren't looking for them or when they weren't apparent. just the number of connections Narit had to all of the different characters, that wasn't necessarily self-evident at the very beginning of the process. And as we spoke to her and you know, you'd see the photographs that she took, it was like, oh, this is really, I mean, you know, very, very, that was super surprising. Alice Cooper, just the fact that there was that divergent element, musical creative element too, was pretty bonkers, because it was at the very beginning of his, you know, and their sort of creative like awakening. So just the fact that it was here in this like super, you know, sweet, wonderful, peaceful place, that was a really big surprise.
Yeah, that he wanted to come in and be the villain.
Exactly.
Anybody that knows Alice Cooper, he's the antithesis of that. He's the sweetest, smartest, funniest guy. Very gentle soul. It's all an act.
Yeah. That was true. It was just amazing just to see how they all fit together, and I love, like you mentioned, the communal nature of how Laurel Canyon was. It's like almost like how life was in a way, just, oh, pop in here, pop in there, stop in for dinner here, dinner there, and just never having to arrange things in advance, which nowadays we do a little bit too much of sometimes.
Yeah, they didn't have the traffic that we have.
Yeah, that's true. And
living in LA is, you know, specifically to Laurel Canyon. Try getting to Laurel Canyon on time for anything.
Yeah. Well, and also seeing how Narit got involved in being a photographer, you know, from being seen as a groupie onto being a techie with the music, and then onto her photography. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And being seen as somebody worth, you know, taking time with, rather than as, you know, a groupie sort of sense.
Yeah, well, she found her calling. I mean, she was drawn to them, I think, spiritually and because of the music, but, you know, and then she found out who she was, as, you know, by being with them. And they all found out about who they were by being together. That's what's fun about it.
Yeah. And finding, and of course, there must be so many understories, like you were saying, Anoosh, in terms of probably, okay, so we saw just a tiny bit of relationship issues and how that came about, and how many others there must have been in that whole neighborhood.
Completely. And yeah, I mean, the process of doing something like this is so fun, because you're trying to give, you know, the truth of the matter and the most, you know, distilled version of that you can. And I think even if you knew all of those little bits and pieces and all those little stories, they might be really interesting factoids. But I think that's one of the things with working with Alison is really amazing. I think she can see straight through to the matter and say, this is what matters and this doesn't. And I think that process for this film was super important, just because you could really get lost in the details and not see the forest for the trees. And that's the beauty of making a documentary about the past, if you really love it and try to make it relevant to the future. And now.
Yeah, I mean, there was obviously a lot more than we have in the film, but it didn't seem like it was the most relevant thing to get into in any detail. And what was interesting and kind of surprising to me too is of, you know, the free love aspect of the time. Bonnie Raitt was the only one that spoke positively about the free love. She was kind of like okay with it. The other women were like, you know, it was free for the guys, but not for the women. As Narit says, we were still too close to the 50s. It was still not, you know, I think that there's been improvements in that certainly since then, but I love Bonnie for being an outlier.
Yeah. And that came through. I loved seeing pretty much the whole story of the mamas and the papas. Mm-hmm. And that really came through in that story, and how Michelle was treated. You know, that was, to me, that was surprising, because of course all we saw was the togetherness of them through their whole careers. Yeah.
And seeing it from the perspective of 2019, right after Me Too, and just getting fired for something like that is a really big deal. So it's interesting to look at it from this perspective, because it was okay for so long.
Yeah. And the fact that we did think, oh yeah, free love, but as most of them said, it was for the men, but it was surprising to me that it wasn't for the women.
Yeah.
Well, it's fantastic. And I, of course, wish you had made a part 3, but we'll look forward to. Do you have any thoughts on taking some of these musicians or themes into more work forward?
Well, it would be great. I've always wanted to do a film about the Doors, but the rights to that footage and music is very tricky. You're right, the Joni Mitchell film, that would be amazing, but she's not, I don't know that she's so into that idea. I hope she comes around to it, because I'd love for her to tell her own story. Yes.
Well, she's still here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I was born in Saskatchewan too.
Oh, wow.
Ooh.
There you go.
Wow.
Backgrounds. So I just want to thank you both for coming. I know, Alison, you've got to go off and feed some horses.
I do, indeed.
How's that been? Have horses been affected through COVID as well? Have you had more rescues? No, although I think we'll start to see it when people start, if they lose their jobs and have to give up their animals. I think what you're starting to see are people needing to have help caring for their animals for the upcoming winter. So people are kind of temporarily adopting just to take the load off of people that have lots of animals. But so far, knock on wood, hopefully that won't happen. Yeah. Thank you for doing that work. Oh,
yeah, of course.
That's so great. And thank you again both for joining us this afternoon. And I hope that you get a chance to take in maybe some DocLands films once we get going in October.
Love to.
Exciting. Thank you so much. This has been just a pure pleasure.
My pleasure completely. Thank you both.
Thank you. Take care. Good luck with the festival.
Thank you very much.